But from the standpoint of what exists in the world, some people are radicals in one particular area, but very few are radicals in multiple areas. For instance, I have met many atheists who very soberly question particular religious teachings and engage them critically, but who rather uncritically support government initiatives the way they are. And it's not that they just have a different ideal of what governments should do, many of them do, but it's also that they don't really see considerable ways to improve upon the status quo. And they see the current set of government functions as being pretty close to ideal, with a few minor tweaks needed here or there. Likewise, many of these same atheists either dismiss the idea of indefinite life extension as impossible, or engage in the same kinds of rationalizations as many of their religious counterparts for why it would be undesirable. The whole argument that death gives meaning to life has been heard espoused by atheists with about the same frequency, given their general population, as by religious people. So these kinds of atheists are not radicals in the political sense, nor in the longevity sense. But I don't mean to single out atheists. Let's look at a lot of libertarians. Many libertarians are pretty conventional in their religious views, and as long as they adopt a live and let live attitude with regard to those views, I don't have any problem with them personally, and I certainly respect their choice in living their lives the way they do. However, it is certainly true that such individuals are less skeptical, less critical, and less principles-oriented in their thinking about religion than they are in their thinking about politics. There are some libertarians who even try to impart a special meaning to their religion by stating that it uniquely is the source of individual rights and liberty, and that without some kind of religious backing, individual rights and liberty would not have a proper defense. With those kinds of libertarians, I have more of an issue, because they refuse to acknowledge the possibility of supporting a desirable goal, which is liberty, on the basis of a different moral or metaphysical framework. Likewise, there are some libertarians who do not embrace far-ranging views of technological progress or indefinite life extension. They support human freedom in the near term, and they imagine that being granted this freedom will enable human beings to start businesses more easily, become more prosperous, live in better houses, have more choice about how to educate their children, have less intrusion by governments and private parties into lifestyle choices, and that's all very good. However, they either don't see it as realistic or don't see it as desirable for the set of technologies generally available to human beings to be dramatically different and dramatically greater than what exists today. There was an absolutely terrible essay published by Murray Rothbard in 1978, upon reading which my respect for Rothbard declined considerably. It's essentially an essay mocking and condemning those libertarians who also embrace ideas of scientific futurism and who are fond of space travel and space colonization and indefinite life extension. Rothbard essentially argued that, one, these people are crazy, and two, that they misunderstand liberty, because liberty doesn't necessarily lead to one particular vision of the desirable. And it's true that under a society where liberty is respected, people would have the choice to use or not to use certain technologies. But that's beside the point. In a society of individual liberty, people will innovate technologically, and so certain technologies will become available that would otherwise not have. And these technologies, bringing with them very desirable functions for many people, will become widely embraced. And I think their allure will change many people's minds ex post about their desirability. Rothbard neglects all of that, and his essay implies essentially that for libertarians the only thing that's desirable is political action and trying to reform the political status quo in whichever ways are immediately accessible. And while some of that political action may be justified, it's certainly not the entire scope of what can be done to improve the world. On the other hand, of course, radicals of the third kind that I mentioned today, radicals for indefinite longevity, often have fairly conventional and uncritical views in the other two fields. There are many luminaries of the indefinite life extension movement that support government funding for longevity research. And while, at first glance, it would be a good idea to devote more funds to that research, certainly a better use for those funds than, say, for fighting the drug war or the war in Iraq, better to use government money for creating something that advances human life than for destroying human life. On second thought, considering the secondary consequences of such funding, one forms a different understanding, that this money would come with strings attached, and those strings might be used as leverage by opponents of this research to restrict its scope and ultimately render the research ineffectual. This is what happened during the Bush administration with stem cell research. Now, someone who is conversant with radicalism of the libertarian sort would be able to readily recognize the perils of seeking government funding for indefinite life extension research. But many longevity proponents are not particularly conversant with ideas of this sort, perhaps because they haven't been exposed to them, or because they see indefinite human longevity as such an important change agent for the status quo that a hit on libertarian principles in the form of accepting government funding, a one-time departure like that, would still be justified in terms of the ultimate consequences. I would, of course, urge them to be careful with this kind of thinking. Now, traditional religiosity is less prevalent among advocates of indefinite human life extension, particularly because indefinite human life extension focuses on making the material human being live longer, and there appears in the minds of many proponents of this aim that there is no way of detaching the corporeal human body from the human mind. The mind does not live beyond the existence of the body. Quite contrary, of course, to the idea of an immaterial soul, which, whether or not it's actually an implication of the theology of today's Abrahamic religions, seems to be believed by most of their adherents. However, it is still possible, and evident in some advocates of indefinite life extension, to adhere to kind of watered down conventional religious beliefs, going to church infrequently on special occasions, still talking in general and fairly vague terms about God or spirituality, and at the same time advocating the progress of human medicine and lifting of this upper limit on human lifespans. Some of these advocates of longevity might even believe in heaven and the idea of an afterlife, except that they would also find it desirable to prolong this one, just as many conventionally religious people believe in an afterlife, but if they have an illness or injury, they're not going to let it kill them, they're going to treat it. So these kinds of individuals would be examples of radicalism in the longevity area, but conventionality in the religious area. And once again, I don't want to suggest that being conventionally religious is the worst possible outcome for that area. Indeed, trying to adopt the principles of a particular religion consistently throughout one's life may lead to quite a perilous outcome. I'm glad that many people are wishy-washy and inconsistent in this area, and that they'd rather stick to what's acceptable in the status quo compared to a literal interpretation of their holy book. But given this observation of radicalism, in most people as being largely confined to one area, how are the people who are radical in multiple areas different? I think the difference comes from a very strong recognition, not just via a verbal acceptance of the premise, but its thorough integration into one's thinking, that there is really only one reality. And while we may think of particular concepts and particular phenomena in isolation and form mental models of those concepts or phenomena, really they are interrelated. They have some kinds of interactions and relationships with one another. So developments in one sphere of human affairs or human thinking will, in some way or another, affect developments in the other. Now, from the standpoint of someone who has a series of principles and wants to achieve a certain aim, it's important to hold views in as many areas of reality as possible that don't undermine one another, that don't cancel each other out in their effects so as not to accomplish anything in particular. Being radical in some respects, but conventional in others, poses the danger that the conventional beliefs, often without one knowing it, will pose an obstacle to the accomplishment of the more fundamental goals of improving reality. And when one begins to evaluate the world from the perspective of goals of major improvement, when one begins to realize how barbaric and woefully inadequate the current current state of affairs is, then radicalism in other areas falls into place. For instance, it seems clear to me that indefinite life extension would face a grueling uphill battle in a world where traditional religiosity holds a great deal of political and to a lesser extent societal power. If traditional religious norms were unquestioned and unexamined through the lens of reason, then many people would just say, oh, this longevity business, it's playing God. It's not what God meant us to do. And why are we struggling against the natural course of things when at the end of it all, we'll have a much better life in heaven? On the other hand, those who advocate indefinite life extension might find their aims much more difficult to realize in an environment where very cumbersome bureaucracies have to spend 15 years approving every new drug or medical process. Surely, the pace of human advancement can be much faster than that. Now, the kinds of atheists who don't really see much to question in the political state of affairs, or who consider death as the natural and sometimes the desirable course of things, will find themselves hard-pressed, really, to see as much of a value in their atheism and critical thinking as is actually there. Because they've rejected the idea of deities, of a just cosmic order, of an afterlife. And for what? To live for a brief instant and perish and forget everything and lose everything and ultimately have everything go to naught for them. Clearly, that's not a very cheerful or satisfying view of the world. It's unfortunately been the reality for every generation that is no longer living. But surely that can't be the limit of what human beings are capable of bringing forth in this world. Otherwise, it would be quite a dreary and inescapably dreary world indeed. And of course, if these kinds of atheists don't even see a way of improving what years of life we have through major changes in political institutions, then they don't really have much of a way out of our current predicament. It's one thing to reject a particular undesirable aspect of the world, but it's an entirely different thing to change it. And those political libertarians who believe that freedom is simply a little bit more breathing room for being pretty conventional underestimate the possibilities and the implications of freedom. And in that, the message of freedom, I think, becomes diluted to the point of not particularly resonating with a lot of other people who might just associate it with a slightly lighter burden, more tax cuts and vouchers, but not a dramatic change of truly oppressive things that are happening in the political world of today. And of course, many libertarians would want a very different perception of their worldview. But in order for that to happen, a greater openness to other forms of radical thinking is required. Ultimately, to think radically about an issue or a set of issues, one needs to forego the idea of using the status quo as a baseline for what is desirable. It could still be used as a baseline for what is feasible. How do we get from here to there? But the goal should be formulated independently of the status quo. Because ultimately, when we look at human values and what I consider to be the most fundamental value, the value of individual life, no principle necessitates that the status quo is conducive to these values. Much of what human societies are has been an accumulation of historical accidents. Likewise, evolution, the process which has brought our biology to its present state, does not care about the survival of the individual. Evolution as a process brings about natural selection of certain traits that are passed along genetically. And very often in the course of that process, not just individuals, but the majority of species, about 99.9% of all species that have ever lived, die out and are selected against. Clearly, when one holds individual human life, at the very least, as the highest value, what happens in the process of evolution, while it may be a fact, is not morally desirable to apply to the human species unless human beings find a way to control their own evolution by means of technology, which gives them a great selective advantage and also gives them the ability to determine their own characteristics in large part. So if the status quo is not conducive to the advancement of human life, then clearly something else is. And what that something else is becomes the subject of a radical's aspirations and ambitions.